In this exercise, we are going to create this animation. This is a rotoscoped animation, meaning that the drawing was done over top of live action video. Now this exercise, although we are here in After Effects, actually begins its life in Photoshop. More on that in just a moment. But let me show you how this rotoscoped animation was eventually utilized. I'm going to come over here to this comp. This is a 30-second animation for Participaction, the Canadian federal agency in charge of inspiring Canadians to be more active. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about how this animation was created, but we will revisit this later in the exercise. Now, you may ask, can't we rotoscope in After Effects? Yes, we can do rotoscoping in After Effects. However, I prefer to do this process in Photoshop. And as you'll see, there are some advantages. First and foremost is having access to Photoshop's collection of brushes makes the possibilities when animating in Photoshop much greater. Before we do anything in Photoshop though, let's take a look at the source files that I hope you've downloaded. I'm here in the jogging animation tutorial folder, and I want to quickly mention a couple of things. This bit of footage here, young woman jogging on the beach, is the bit of footage that we are going to be using in our rotoscoping in Photoshop. However, there are other options for creating artwork of a running sequence. Let me show you what I mean. I have a folder in here called Muybridge. Muybridge refers to Edward Muybridge. If you don't know the name, you will definitely know Muybridge's photos. Muybridge, of course, was the inventor of the sequential photo. I've used Muybridge's photos in these Illustrator files, running vector and running vector sequence. Let me show you what those look like. In Illustrator, I've created some guide layers with Edward Muybridge's photos on them. And using the pen tool, I've created some vector outlines of those shapes. In this file, running vector sequence, you can see that I've taken each one of those vector shapes and aligned them like this. I've sequenced them by putting them each on their own layer. When this Illustrator file is imported into After Effects, you get something that looks like this. I'm going to leave this for a separate exercise. Let me come back to Photoshop though and show you the file that I've created here. In Photoshop, I've imported this movie file. And by using this layer, I was able to create some animated frames, what we call rotoscoping. So this is the exercise that we are going to be doing. The first thing I want you to do is come to the File drop-down menu and create a new file. In your new document panel, create a new document that is 1920 pixels in width and 1080 pixels in height. My orientation is going to be horizontal, and my resolution is going to be 72 pixels per inch. My color mode is RGB. Once you have all those settings, you can click Create. Now before we import the movie file, I just want to mention something. You'll notice that I have my timeline panel open here at the bottom. If you don't have your timeline panel open, come to the Window drop-down menu and choose Timeline from this menu. You'll also notice that I have another menu here called Anim Design 2. This is a free plugin that makes doing this type of rotoscoping a little bit easier. I'm not going to use it in this animation. However, if you are interested in working with this, take a look at this post on the Idea Refinery that shows how to download it and install it. It also has links to several tutorial sites that show you how to work with it. For this animation though, it's not necessary. Let's import our footage. I'm going to come to the File drop-down menu and select Place Embedded. I'm going to come to the Jogging Animation Tutorial folder, and I'm going to select Young Woman Jogging on the Beach, Slow Motion Shot. Select Place. I'm going to press Return. I now have this placed. However, I've not yet created an actual timeline for me to work on. You'll notice down here in my timeline panel, there's a button that says Create Video Timeline. Let's do that here. Our video now has a timeline to play out on. You can see this by clicking on this little blue doohickey here called the current time indicator, and if I drag this across my timeline, what's known as scrubbing, you can see that I can see the playback of this video. If I drag backwards, I can see this backwards in time. If I bring my current time indicator back to the beginning of my timeline and press my space bar or this play button here, I can play this forward. If I press my space bar again, I can stop that. Now what we're going to be doing is taking every frame of this video and redrawing it on a new layer above using one of Photoshop's painting brushes. However, we have a big issue. Currently, this video's playback rate is at 30 frames per second. 30 frames per second, even for a short rotoscoping project like this, would mean a lot of drawing on our part. What we need to do is change the frame rate playback of this video to something much lower so that we're not having to draw quite so many frames. How do we do that? Well, we're going to come over here to the timeline panel. Now, since I'm not using this Anim Design 2, I'm going to close this. Now, I'm going to click on the option button for this timeline panel to reveal this menu. One of the options is here called Set Timeline Frame Rate. I'm going to select that. And you'll notice that the frame rate is what the imported video file was, which was 30 frames a second, or pretty close to 30 frames a second. What I'm going to do is change this playback rate to something much slower. I'm going to click inside this window and select that number and type in 2. Yes, in fact, the frame rate that we want from this video is not 30 frames a second, but 2 frames per second. Remember, this video is in slow motion, so it's not like we're going to be missing anything. I'm going to say OK. You can see now our video layer has shrunk considerably. There's many fewer frames to that file. I'm going to zoom in to this layer by clicking on this slider and dragging to the right. And I'm going to get that layer to fill my timeline panel a little bit more like this. If I press my spacebar to play this video back, you'll notice that it's not quite as continuous. However, like I mentioned, because it's in slow motion, we are not missing anything in our movement. Now, I don't want to animate this entire video. I just want the section where she's roughly in the center of the screen from here when her foot is on the ground to about this section here when her right foot again is on the ground, which represents a single run cycle that we could loop to create a continuous run sequence. Let me mark those 2 places on the timeline by clicking this handle here. This is my work area handle. I can create a work area by clicking and dragging that handle so I know where I have to begin. I'm going to move my current time indicator to the point where her right foot is again flat on the ground right there. And I'm going to take this work area end handle and drag that to this point here. To see what that loop looks like, I'm going to press my space bar and I'm going to let that play. Now, this is not bad, but I do have one issue. It's not a complete loop because the position of our runner is slightly different in the first frame than it is in the last frame. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a very subtle animation so that I can keep my runner at the very center of my screen. First of all, let's make sure that your rulers are showing. I'm going to come to the View drop-down menu and make sure that Rulers is turned on with the check mark or Command R on my keyboard. I'm going to position my current time indicator right at the beginning of my work area. I'm going to click on my vertical ruler and drag out a guide and place that over the center of my jogger, like this. You'll notice that there's a straight line that goes essentially from the back of her neck right through her foot. That is essentially her center of balance. I'm going to drag out another guide from the top ruler, and I'm going to position that roughly here, about the level of her hips. Now, in the playback, I want my runner to stay in that position as much as possible. As I click on my current time indicator and scrub that forward, you can see, though, that she quickly moves out from that position. I'm going to drag to the end of my work area, and what I need to do is create a position keyframe. If we were in After Effects, you would know that we would want to reveal our position property and then create keyframes for that. Well, that's exactly what we're going to do here, too. I'm going to click on this to reveal this timeline a little bit better. I'm going to twirl down this arrow, and you'll notice that I have some properties and stopwatches just like I do in After Effects. They're a little bit different here, but for the most part, they work exactly the same. The only real difference is that you'll notice that there isn't a position property as such. Here, it's just underneath the transform property. So let's do this. Let's take my current time indicator. I'm going to start again at my beginning of my timeline, and I'm going to click the stopwatch for transform to create a keyframe for that property. I'm now going to move my current time indicator to the end of my work area, and I'm now going to click once on my video layer, and I'm going to drag it back to the left. If I hold down my shift button, I can constrain that to a strictly horizontal move. And again, I'm going to position this so that the center line is roughly at the back of the neck of my runner. If I click on my current time indicator and drag that back to the beginning of my work area and press my play button, you can see here right in the middle of her stride, she gets very far away from that center point again. I'm going to position my current time indicator roughly in the halfway point between those two keyframes. And I'm going to make a small adjustment to again position my video layer so that her hips fall roughly at that center line and the back of her neck roughly falls along that vertical center line. I'm going to position one more keyframe here, again, just by clicking and dragging that roughly here. If I play that back, I can see that now my runner is staying very close to the center of my screen and looping fairly well. So from here, we need to do our rotoscoping. In order to do that, we need to have a layer in which to do our drawing. But we're going to create a special type of layer called a video group. And here is how we're going to do it. In our timeline panel, you'll notice that this layer has an icon that looks like a film strip and a downward arrow. I'm going to click on that downward arrow, and from this pop-up menu, I'm going to select New Video Group. And you can see a new video group has been created right above our existing layer. If I open up my layers panel, you can see that there is this new video group, but there's nothing inside of it. I can put a new layer inside of that though by coming to the bottom of this layers panel and clicking once on my new layer icon. And you can see that a new layer has been put into my video group layer in my layers panel. As well, a new layer indicator has appeared in my timeline panel. I'm just going to click on that and drag it so that it aligns with the beginning of my work area. This is the first of my layers that I'm going to be drawing on to create my animation. But I want to draw your attention to something first. Currently, there are 10 frames that make up our animation. We can see them by dragging our current time indicator over our timeline. There is our first frame. There's our second, third, fourth, fifth, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th. The 11th frame is going to be a repeat of the first one to create our loop. That means that this current frame is actually 10 frames long. That means I'm going to have to change the duration of this frame. I can do that by clicking on the tail end of this layer indicator and dragging to the left. You'll see that there is a time code, and when the duration says 00:01, that means that this layer has now been reduced to just one frame in length. Let's create the remaining layers for our animation by coming to our layers panel and selecting our layer from our video group and holding down our option button and clicking and dragging so that we see this double-headed arrow and creating a new layer. You can see that new layer popped up here. I'm going to create 10 in total. I'm not going to create one for this last frame here just because that will be a repetition of our first frame. The next thing is let's choose the brush that we are going to be drawing with. I'm going to come over to my toolbox and select my brush tool. Once I've selected that though, I'm going to come over to my brushes panel, and from here, the brush I choose will depend upon what tools I'm using to draw with. If all I have is a mouse, then I recommend either using a soft round or a hard round brush. These are non-pressure sensitive brushes. However, if you have a pressure sensitive drawing tablet like I have, then you can use one of these pressure sensitive brushes that will give you a more calligraphic appearance. I'm going to continue on with this hard round brush. I'm going to make sure that my color that I'm painting with is white by clicking on the foreground color picker and making sure that I'm working with white and say OK. I'm almost done. One more thing that I need to do. I'm going to come to my background layer and I'm going to change its color by clicking on the background color picker in my toolbox and choosing this blue. I'm now going to select that layer and choose Fill, Background Color, OK. That will allow me to see my drawings against a colored background. I'm going to zoom in to my drawing. If I hold down my space bar, I can position that drawing into my screen a little bit better. I can resize my brush by using a keyboard shortcut. To increase the size of my brush, I can press the right square bracket on my keyboard to make that larger, or I can press the left square bracket on my keyboard to make that smaller. Now, as I'm drawing, I want to make sure that I'm working on the correct frame, and I want to draw in such a way that I'm just pulling out the contour without getting too carried away with drawing any of the details. I'm also not being too concerned about being absolutely perfect with my lines. If I make a mistake, I can always come back to my toolbox and choose my eraser tool to erase something, or I can press Command Z to undo the lines I've just done. If you want to put in facial features, I'll let you decide whether or not to do that, but I'm just going to put a little indication of her eye. And there is frame 1. If I move my current time indicator to frame 2, you can see there is the next frame that I need to draw. Make sure that you select that frame though in your timeline in order to draw on it. Continue on with drawing the outline. I now have a very rough rotoscoped animation over top of my video layer. I'm going to come over to my layers panel and scroll down and turn off the visibility of this video layer just so that I can see this a little bit better. And you can see that if I press my space bar, I have a rough animation. Now, I mentioned earlier that the first frame should be the same as the last frame. However, in a running sequence like this, that would actually cause a little bit of a stutter in the playback of this. So in fact, I don't need to duplicate that frame, although I often will do that for a looping animation like this. But for this one, because of the speed of the movement, I'm going to leave off that last frame, and I'm going to take my work area and just drag that down one frame so that my work area is now just these frames. If I press my space bar, you can see how this loops continuously. Now this is admittedly much rougher than my previous one, but it still has a certain hand-drawn charm to it. The last thing I want to talk about is how to export this file with transparency and import that file into After Effects. What I mean by exporting with transparency is that I would like to be able to take this animation and put it onto any type of background, not just a blue background. So what I'm going to do in my layers panel is I'm going to turn off the visibility of this blue layer, so that all I see is the white strokes of my animation and the checkerboard pattern of my transparency. I'm also going to crop my image by choosing my crop tool and resizing this. I don't want to make it too tight. I'm going to press return. I want to make sure that all my animation stays inside of that frame. Once I have that done, I'm going to come to my timeline panel's option button to click on this button here, render video. Now, I don't want to actually render a video. What I want to do is export what's called an image sequence. In order to do that, I'm going to come here first to Adobe Media Encoder and change that to a Photoshop image sequence. That'll give us some different options down below here. One of them is the format. Make sure that you choose PNG. What we want to be able to do is export the transparency of the background, which is what PNG is built for. I'm not going to worry too much about the other settings here. I do want to draw your attention to the range that is going to be exported. You can see it's set to work area, which is exactly what we want, and to the number of frames that we want to export. We also want to make sure that we change the render options so that the alpha channel is set to straight, unmatted. This will make sure that the transparency in the background is exported. The final thing I want you to do is to name your file and then choose a folder to put it into. I'm going to put something into my jogging animation tutorial folder. I'm going to select new folder and call this jogging PNGs and select create. When I select choose and then render, those individual frames will be exported as PNGs into that folder. Let's see how we can import this image sequence into After Effects. I have a new project with a blank composition inside it. I'm going to come to the File drop-down menu and I'm going to select Import import file. I'm going to navigate to my jogging PNGs. There are my PNG images. It's kind of hard to tell, but there is my PNG image, a white drawing over top of a transparent background. In order to import this, I just need to select the very first one of this numbered PNG sequence, and you'll see that After Effects has already checked off this PNG sequence option. Once I select Open, After Effects will put all of these images into one file called an image sequence. If I drag that into my composition, you can see that now is placed inside of my composition. If I press my spacebar, well, I get to see it once very quickly and then it disappears. But I want this to run continuously over the entire length of my 30-second timeline. In order to do that, I'm going to select this image sequence layer in my timeline, and I'm going to hold down my control button to reveal this menu. I'm going to choose my time option and choose Enable Time Remapping. Time remapping is a way that allows us to play with and adjust the timing of the playback of our layers. I'm going to zoom in so I can see this just a little bit better. I'm going to click on my layer indicator and the tail end of this to drag that out further into my timeline. If I press my spacebar now, you'll see that again it plays the first cycle of my running, but now rather than disappearing completely, it just holds on the last frame of my animation. What I need to do now is create a loop for this cycle. To do that, I'm going to again bring my current time indicator back to the beginning of my timeline. I'm going to come over here to my time remap property, and I'm going to hold down my option button and then click once on the stopwatch. That will open up my expressions field. I don't need to type in anything into here. What I will do though is open up my expressions list by clicking on this arrow, and from this menu choosing property, loop out duration. To accept that, I'm going to click once into my composition panel. Now, when I press my spacebar, you can see that my runner is running continuously, although a little bit quickly. I'm going to press my spacebar to stop that and bring that back to the beginning. There is a way that I can adjust the playback speed. These two keyframes for the time remap property represent the beginning and end of our animation. If I want that animation to go more slowly, I just need to space out those two keyframes. Now, when I press my spacebar, she's running at a much more realistic speed. And there is our rotoscoping exercise.